Thank you so much, Tom. We are really happy to come and share part of our work with the team in this webinar series. I'm going to be presenting about part of some work that we've been undertaking at the Institute with some colleagues from the Institute, as well as we've partnered with a number of institutions from Latin America and UK to undertake this study. So I'm going to be sharing with you today a comparative perspective on the evolution and sustainability of a pastoralist production system. And basically, these are some of the key lessons that we've picked on from a number of studies and a series of papers that we've been able to publish. So we've had two, not parallel, but there have been sequential studies. So one, we did it under the Learning and Lessons from Latin America, which was a partnership that was funded by DFID. And we partnered with GRADE. GRADE is a policy research institute similar to us. They're based in Peru. And we're also supported by the University of Sussex through the Institute of Development Studies. And then we've had another series of papers that we've worked together with Tom and some colleagues from Northern Lenses Trust, which is actually based in Kenya. This is an organization, like an NGO, that have been promoting community conservancies. In there, in part of the team, we've had colleagues from University of California, Davis. I can say Margaret, one of our colleagues actually is on this, is Monique. Monique is on joining us in this webinar, and another colleague from Converge, and this has been funded by the Global Challenges Research Fund and the European Research Council. So to begin with, just again to tell you some of the things that you already know, I mean, but then give a contextual background from an economic perspective. So we know that pastoralist is basically an extensive livestock production system. And it's the main production system in the rangelands. The rangelands, they cover about 40% of the land surface. And I think the estimates, we have different estimates by a number of studies, but the estimates range from about 200 to 500 million pastoralists. But the common thing is that most of these pastoralists live in developing countries. So to begin with, I'm going to start with the value of pastoralism for different contexts. And I'm just, again, sharing some numbers with you. I apologize that sometimes economists love to throw numbers. But in terms of contextualizing pastoralism in Kenya, what I wanted to communicate here is that in terms of both land area, it's quite significant. In terms of land mass, the area that is considered to be under pastoral production system is about 67% of the total land mass in Kenya. And of course, if this is comparable, majority of the Eastern African countries, it's about 50% in both, for example, Uganda and Tanzania. So most of what pastoralists, of course, do is keeping livestock. And here I'm just showing the economic value from cattle alone. And you find that if you were to count and consider that the number of animals actually farmed, 34% of the cattle is kept in purely pastoralist systems. And then we have another 54 that is in agro-pastoralism areas. So the key distinction is that one, the pastoralist system, these are usually like the completely arid areas. And then in the agro-pastoralist system, we have semi-arid conditions. But then, so jointly between agro-pastoralism and pastoralism, they account for about 88% of the cattle that is kept. And they actually produce about 67% of the beef that is produced in the country. But the key thing is that, of course, when you look at the nature of the extensive system that they usually use, it's a low input, low output system. And of course, this has created a lot of misconception about the entire system as a whole. But because many people consider it to be subsistive. And for example, right now, when you look at the policy discussions, when you look at the policy discussion, the idea is to move them towards the more commercially oriented farming and feedlots. But then, of course, you can actually see even right now, both of these highly commercial systems, only a small percentage of, for example, beef production. So what the key message here, the key takeaway here is that economically, they do make sense, even though they're considered to be subsistive. And of course, they account for quite a number of, a large proportion of, in terms of economic population. So the unique feature about pastoral lands, which is important for the productive system, and this is one of the things that we've been analyzing, is that most of the pastoral lands are considered unsuitable for traditional agriculture in the sense of, crop farming. Again, as I've said, most of them would be arid and semi-arid, and then they are characterized by low rainfall and high or very low temperatures, depending on where. So, for example, in the savannah, this would be now the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, most of it would be high temperatures. If you consider pastoralist areas in places like Latin America, most of them would be in places where, again, you have very little rainfall, highland, the altitude tends to be quite high, and the temperatures tend to be very low. So that of course informs the nature of animals that they keep there. So in this study, one of the key things, of course, we learned was that comparison between the practices and experiences in Latin America. And in this case, Latin America, we featured on Peru. And then in the Kenyan case, we featured on Kenya. So the characteristics, like we're showing that, there were some stark differences, but of course, because of the context. But then the common underlying was that, in Kenya, you have low rainfall. In Peru, you still have low rainfall. And then in Peru, because of the Andean mountains, you are in high areas. Of course, the temperatures were very cool. In Kenya, this would be in the lowlands. The temperatures tend to be very high. And then, of course, that informs the animals that are kept. But then, of course, one of the things that we noted that because of the animals kept in Peru, they mainly keep alpacas and llamas, but this is mainly for wool production. They had a high market orientation, whereas in the case of Kenya, the animals are kept specifically for meat. And then because the meat is usually oriented to the domestic market, you find that in terms of market integration, it's a bit low. And then the orientation towards commercial, meat or beef production is quite low. But then the key areas, and this is now what we narrowed on, was that we looked at how the communities are organizing themselves in terms of accessing land and utilizing land and getting income from those lands. So the common line here was that, in these lands, again, like we mentioned earlier, you cannot undertake, crop farming in these areas. It's completely unsuitable, and actually nobody has even tried it. So land management then becomes critical, especially when you think of pastoralist production systems. Traditionally, communities have relied on customary institutions and practices to maintain their lands. The key, of course, the difference, especially when you consider the sub-Saharan Africa and Kenya, and as a good example, is that because you have a lot of communities and basically tribal lands, the practices are more or less the same, but of course you have some unique characteristics that will differ from one tribe to the other. But the key thing is that what these systems and these practices have in common is that they guarantee better land access. And of course, the key challenge, of course, is that they also tend to suffer from CPR challenges, but then I'll be explaining how these have been coming about. But then one of the things that we've also established, especially in the more recent study that we did and with the Exeter and the group, was that communities possess, ecological knowledge, and their customary practices actually help pastoralism to thrive in these lands. So when you compare in terms of trying to change, or communities that have moved away or weakened their customary practices, then of course you find that they tend to suffer more of the CPR challenges, and even their output in terms of economic output, when you look at the value of beef that they're producing, or the value of meat for goats, tends to be quite low as a result of this. So then the key challenge is, why is this happening? So one, and this again was something that we found was common when you looked at pastoralist communities, both in East Africa and in Latin America, was that in both contexts, pastoralists are facing increasing pressure on land. And then we were able to identify 5 key drivers. I'll be diving a bit deeper on this to explain more in detail. But of course, the key important one of the unfavorable public policies, of course, population growth. Then there's also pressure from competing users of land from other economic activities. Of course, then there's urbanization. And lastly, we have the effects of climate change and variability. So we first start looking at how the land tenure regimes have evolved and how this have ended up affecting communities. So we, in the case of Latin America, they have a better documentation in terms of anthropology of how those communities were living even before they were colonized. So similar to East Africa, they were colonized. It's only that the colonial masters were different. But even tracing it from that particular period, from the colonial period to the post-colonial period and to successive governments, what again we found that was in common was that governments, development agencies favored land liberalization policies. Most of these policies were meant to, or the objective why they were being pushed was that they were expected to increase access to land, increase investments on land, and improve livelihoods of these particular communities. And the key, in fact, the most common one, of course, were the land titling programs that now you could give an individual a title deed that guarantees him the rights and access to that particular land. But this, we have a lot of evidence that now shows that these policies that were being pushed and favored by government did not actually lead to those objectives. So in fact, what happened was that the objectives were actually the opposite. So instead of increasing access to land, land now became concentrated in a few individuals. And this also led to a lot of social inequalities among the different pastoral communities. Some other studies also kind of document that the perceived investments in land that would have been made as a result of promoting land utilization did not actually happen. And again, this was because of a number of factors like the suitability, the rate of return in some of these lands, and also, of course, lack of infrastructure in terms of supply of public goods. So the key then thing was that when you look at, in contrast, what is the counterfactual? Despite the fact that public policies have been biased toward pastoralism, you find that communities that have maintained collective land access, have actually benefited from economic scale in production, reducing the risk, especially when you consider the cost of enforcing individual land rights. And when you think about equity and social equity, especially for larger communities, you find that collective land access guarantees greater access to resources. When you think about pastoralists, of course, some of the key resources you think of is basically water, pasture, and minerals, especially for animals. So for under individual land rights, if you don't have access to this, then you have to purchase or to purchase those rights or list those rights. But when land have been managed under community systems, then this are actually shared. In our case, we find that communities have been using customary norms to maintain this. The only challenge has been that most of these customary norms, their documentation came much later. But then when you talk to the old folks in these communities, they actually know them, and they can actually take you through what they consider to be the cultural laws, what were the punishment that was meted when families or individuals violated this. But it's only that it's not documented in a law like we currently have, that you can actually say that you're violating these sections of this particular law. So the key puzzle when we were discussing this for us was trying to understand, given the benefits that we already see from maintaining communal land access, why has public policy not shifted to support public to support pastoral, support pastoralists, especially in maintaining the collective land access that they can actually use to improve this. So so we began by looking at the changes in the land tenure regimes, what was informing this, and how these have changed over time. So we followed the bundle of rights as described by Ostrom, looking at the right to access, the right to withdraw, how you manage, how you're able to exclude others from using that right, and how you can actually transfer in terms of selling or leasing the rights that has been allocated to an individual. And under this, we were able to try not to track. And this is just a key summary of some of the changes that happened, of course, like in East Africa. So you find that, for example, looking at the 3 East African countries, this is Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, you find that in the pre-colonial system and the colonial era, basically, we had similar systems. There are some tweaks that were a bit different, but basically it was the same, that nobody had specific ownership to a specific piece of land. Communities were able to access, and communities respected each other's rights. And for most of these communities, they even had systems of ensuring access, providing temporary land rights where people are migrating from one area to another. And they had ways of negotiating and getting trade-offs. That if you, for example, a community that was moving and didn't have pasture and you moved into the territory of another community, they had mechanisms in which they could actually engage and exchange and agree how to share those resources. And of course, after independence, now what happened is that, of course, we had now the formal laws that had been introduced during the colonial period. And from there, you actually see some kind of departure, but then the commonality is that, you know, as these countries were adapting the land laws, initially we borrowed heavily from the colonial laws, but then of course in some countries like Uganda that had civil strife, we had several coups in the 70s and the 80s. Then this kind of affected that transition. The only country that was different in Kenya was in East Africa was in Tanzania. And basically what happened in Tanzania is that in the post-independent government came up with a collective system where, again, nobody is bequeathed land to own privately, but land is owned communally through villages, and they established a system that would allocate access rights to this. But then this system collapsed in the mid-80s, and now again it kind of now moved to be almost again uniform, to whereby you can actually see that the trajectory has been moving more from the collective to the individual land, individual land rights, and allocating access and withdrawal rights to individuals rather than to the community. So the key thing was that if you look at the transition and how this has panned off in the different communities, one thing that really was striking for us was that although the laws and the transition, there was a lot of promotion of individual land rights, especially to try and privatize land tenure. They not only ended up interfering with the customary norms, but they actually did not help pastoralists improve land management. So one of the things that you could think of is that, for example, during in the colonial era and post the first governments after gaining independence, most of the governments settled on like land resettlement programs. But then the key thing that they never addressed was that in the areas where they were going to resettle people, that land was not free. It wasn't like an owned. This used to be territories for certain tribes. It's only that the way they were using them it was not documented, and they didn't have like formal titles to those lands. And then, of course, again, when we started now developing the land laws, most of these land laws again were just centered on modernizing pastoralism, doing away with practices such as the nomadic pastoralism, where you move from one area to another, failing to appreciate that the mobility is actually a sustainability practice. And then, of course, they were never supported with the public goods. For example, like in the Kenyan law, one of the things that they aimed to do was to make pastoralists sedentary, then provide them with extension services and put up infrastructure. But actually, this would never happen. So, of course, the fact that they tried to modernize them, the accompanying investments that were to be made were never made. And actually, this started eroding, the customary norms. And then, of course, as you'd expect, then you have the CPR issues, especially the issue of exploitation of land, and some people now kind of taking the prime areas, to now try and introduce private land tenures in some of these systems. And this was done again mainly by elites. And then, of course, it created pressures now for some of these communities, where now people are, as population is increasing, and you're seeing some people benefiting from land more than others. And that was not what was envisioned, especially when you look at it from a cultural perspective, where people are expected to be sharing the resources equally. But then once you introduce the inequality, especially in sharing of resources, then as economic agents, you'd expect them to behave differently. You have a different incentive for them. And actually now in the modern era, that has intensified. And now we have more fights over resources. I think like if you followed Kenyan media, you will have noticed like 2 months ago in one of the pastoral areas up north, there was a big conflict because of a fight over pasture. And actually what happens is that, we have like 3 communities that consider that area to be their pasture land. Nobody has a title to that land. And then, of course, given that most of them can access arms, then it becomes the person who is the strongest, who can fight the fiercest war, is able to access those resources. So the key thing here is that when you look at whatever was being promoted, for example, trying to promote these state-led policies that were supposed to move pastoralists, like in the case of Kenya, to form like ranches and to try and improve marketing, but they actually never happened. And these state-led initiatives trying to promote land markets and individualization of land tenure, although they are promoted in using the new laws, the investments that they thought would go hand in hand actually never happened. So one of the things that we try to do now in these particular studies, we try to characterize, and we came up with a typology for both the Kenyan case and the Latin America case, just again to try and make sure that we have the right comparison. And what we are doing, again, looking at the bundle of rights, we were able to come up. This is the typology we developed for pastoralist communities in Kenya. So we have an adjudicated communal lands, and these are lands whereby the land is owned by an adjudication. Land adjudication is whereby you demarcate the land and establish boundaries, and then you provide for who owns land that is contained within a certain boundary. So the unadjudicated communal lands basically have never been adjudicated, so nobody can actually even tell you the size. Of course, people estimate, and right now, of course, we can even use like satellite imagery to try and estimate the entire land size, but it has not been formally registered, as a parcel of land that has within this boundary that is owned by a defined number of people. So the unadjudicated lands, most of the area in north of Kenya is still unadjudicated, and partly is because those communities have resisted to change that system. They own the land communally. As long as they recognize you as part of the community, then you have equal rights in terms of going and accessing that land. So one of the initial land policies, what they tried to do was to kind of try to maintain them to use the land communally, but now establish ranches whereby now you can create specific boundaries, and you can actually put beacons to show that land within a specific boundary will be owned by this group of people. And this group of people are actually registered, and you had a register of members. who could actually claim ownership. And then what happened over time, these group ranches have been collapsing, and this has been the path they've actually been following. So you start with, when you look at the trajectory for the collective land access, you started with an indicated communal lands, then they became registered as community land. Then once some communities decided now we need to separate and no longer access land communally, then of course you go to the register and then you divide land against the people in that particular register. And then now everybody now ends up having private tenure. So this is a key trajectory in terms of the pressures that has been happening in community lands. We've had a lot of research that has been done, especially on the lands that are occupied by the Maasai community. But then this is something that is still ongoing, the fact that we have other lands that still are adjudicated. So right now, when we're doing this work, one of the things that we were trying to do was to inform a community land law that kind of tries to stop this trajectory, because again, of the mounting evidence is that some of these lands, the fact that you get private tenure doesn't really help you, because you need to move because of the harsh ecological environments and how you want to utilize that land, especially for economic activity. When you compare this with the Andean case, again, we find that the key difference was the family organization within the Andean communities. But again, you find that in terms of the trajectory, most of them, you start with the community land, then they either have communal condominiums or family condominiums. And then basically they move towards fragmented communities, and eventually they end up with private tenure. So this trajectory has been because of a number of pressures that I've mentioned, and I'll still be explaining more how this particular trajectory happened. But ultimately, what we were finding is that as you move towards private tenure, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are helping pastoralism. So what we find that in both contexts, there is increasing trends towards individualization of land tenure. And then of course, this now calls a lot of questions, especially on the sustainability of pastor's productive system. So one, what happens to, remember that by the ecological characteristics of these lands, they are really not suitable for anything else other than extensive livestock production. So what happens to accessing some of these resources? What does it mean for those particular livelihoods of the communities that are actually in these areas? So we analyze each of the key drivers and how this helps, how this has contributed towards the trend that we've explained. So one of the key drivers, and this is something that up to date we are still trying to lobby and getting more people to recognize, is that we have a lot of misconceptions about pastoralism, right from the 60s up to date. Even today, we have some policymakers who consider pastoralism to be a backward agricultural system. This was mainly because in the 70s and the 80s, there were a lot of land intensification programs that were being promoted. And people kind of thought that that was the in thing. As you are talking about green revolution, or even looking at the agrarian revolution in Europe, the idea was that this system, we are backward and we need to change it. We need to modernize it for us to be able to get some economic value from it. And unfortunately, people have been looking at the pastoralism as an economic irrelevant system. And again, one of the key challenges is the fact that they forget that, it's not, when you think about the way they have been stereotyped, is that pastoralism, is not friendly for the environment, without necessarily looking at why, for example, the degradation has been happening in pastoral lands. Most of this has been, of course, because of the CPR issues, where there's a lot of overexploitation, and the fact that there's nobody who has an incentive to care for the land. But then, of course, people tend to overlook this and kind of focus on how they want to read it. So here, what we've seen from like this is a recent cutting from last week, is that you'll find that even in the news media, there's a lot of misreporting. For example, you know, when people look at that particular land, they always consider alternative uses of that land without necessarily thinking through what that land means to those communities and what they're doing to those communities, especially if they manage to push them out and convert the land to something else. So one of the key pressures, especially that has been promoting the misconceptions, I think we've heard a lot about the land grabs, because when you look at large scale parcels of land right now, because of population growth, you can only find them in pastoral areas where people have been accessing land communally. When you think about some of the key projects, especially the mega projects, and this is what I wanted to show here. When for example, this is in the case of Kenya, we've had these huge transport corridors. So we have two key transport corridors that the government has been trying to implement. One is towards the south of the country, the other one passes up north. So this corridor has a rail system, has a road infrastructure, and then you have an oil pipeline. And part of it is also informed by the extractive industries. Most of the minerals, especially oil and gas right now, is being discovered in these pastoral communities. And actually what the government is trying to do is now put up this mega infrastructure. And of course, that is really a key driver in terms of individualization and privatization of land tenure. So some of these projects, what they've ended up doing is, once, like this is an airport that was put up in Isiolo. Isiolo was considered to be like 100% a pastoral area, and a few areas, especially as you go towards Mount Kenya, because of the ecological environment, were considered to be agro-pastoral areas. When this land investments, when this project was announced, then immediately the government started putting up an airport. Then what you had was a mad rush of people trying now to go and buy land there. You can only buy land that has individual tenure. Land that has been accessed collectively, you cannot access those rights, because usually those rights are passed on through inheritance. You transfer them to your kin, to your children and their children, but you cannot actually sell them. You can go and live there, and then once the community accepts you as one of them, again, you can easily access some of these lands. But what you saw was more of somebody wanting to purchase land, fence it off, and then wait to sell it off, because this is kind of encouraging land speculation. This is something that, again, as we found out, was similar pressure in the Latin America. So of course, in the Andean Mountains, we have some extractive industries that are taking place there, and they have a similar effect that, like you see in the case of Kenya. And of course, some of these mega projects, like the Southern Corridor, has not been implemented. But of course, the fact that it was announced, then you could actually see, like the Southern Corridor, where we have the Maasai community. Most of this land, people went there to speculate. And of course, the incentive is quite good if you think about the short run. And actually what happened, most of these communities ended up selling their land so that they could actually get the quick return. But then forgetting that once you eat this money, once the money has been utilized, then that's it. For the generations to come, if they have no investments in social capital, education, especially education, and making sure that they acquire skills, they cannot even move to the urban centers where they can actually get jobs. Then the other key, of course, pressure that we have, if you look at most of the pastoral communities in Kenya, they are located next to wildlife reserves. And then this has its own complication, because what happens is that as soon as you start privatizing land and the natural reserve on the game parks, then you immediately exacerbate human-wildlife conflict. And I'll be showing you this in a bit while. So the other key thing, of course, that we mentioned is the rate of urbanization. So when you look at our history, I mean, from the trajectory from the 60s, we don't have data before that. Most of our data starts from the 60s. But then you see that there's been a very steep trend in urbanization. And what urbanization has been doing, of course, coupled with population growth. And you can actually see that, for example, countries like Kenya, we have a very high population growth rate. It's been coming down, but relatively, when you compare it with other regions, we are still quite high. What this has been doing is that it's been creating pressure for land for settlement. And of course, as people want to buy more land to put up homes, you know, prime agricultural land is quite expensive. So if you are an urban area near a pastoral area, like in this case, if you consider the location of Nairobi, I can try and show you here. If you consider the location of Nairobi, this area below Nairobi as you go towards the border with Tanzania, this used to be occupied by the Maasai community. And the Ma community, especially in areas like Kajiado, you know, these were traditionally collective lands. But then because of the pressure as Nairobi was growing, this became target because land was cheap. And you know, people quickly invaded these lands and introduced private tenure, and there's been a lot of land speculation. So within a decade, you know, most of these lands have already been privatized. And now the Maasai found themselves being pushed into Tanzania. The lucky thing is that we have Maasai community on both sides of the border. So using customary norms, they can actually access pasture on this other side of the border, because once they sold their land, they never stopped from keeping animals. So they continue to keep animals, although they had sold off most of these lands. Of course, one of the penalties that they have really suffered as a result of this is that initially they used to try to graze in the game parks, but then of course, at some point, because of increasing poaching, nowadays it's illegal. If you are found in the park without getting a permit to graze there, then you're arrested and there are penalties. And in some cases, of course, you're also exposing your animals to very deadly diseases. For example, like if cows interact with buffaloes, if they are grazing in the same ecosystem, then some of the key diseases like foot and mouth disease and discus fever, which are devastating to animal life, you know, especially for cattle. They have a huge, you tend to lose a lot of animals within a very short time. And those are huge losses for some of these pastoralists. So you find that over time, they actually become poor as a result. So this, already ahead of myself, I was explaining some of the consequences of some of this. And then, so here I'm just explaining that when you look at both in the case of Peru and in the case of Kenya, what happened is that for the commonalities were that you have an institutional crisis in the sense that the collapse of the customary institutions and the customary norms are no longer now being enforced in how people access land. Then you have the government-led policies and laws that are geared more towards private tenure. So this was happening in both cases. I think the only driver that was unique in the case of Kenya and many when we considered East Africa, was the issue of urbanization. So urbanization was not a key driver of land tenure changes in Peru and the Andean region. But ultimately what you end up with is people, gravitating towards, individual land-based land regimes, and actually these are not compatible with sustainable pastoralism. And of course, some of these key effects was that, I was explaining that pastoralists now ended up being worse off economically and as well as socially, because with the collapse of the social norms, then it means that they cannot benefit from some of the risk mitigation, customary risk mitigation practices that they used to practice before. And then now what you end up now is that you have a lot of animals grazing on a small piece of land. The land becomes degraded. You continue to lose pasture. You continue to have poor animals. If you could kind of use that terminology to define animals that have low productivity. And an example I can give is that if you consider the first slide I was showing you on the economic value of cattle from pastoralism, you'll find that although, yeah, you're saying that 67% of the beef that we produce, the data was for last year. So those 67% came from agro-pastoral and pastoral areas. When you look at the rate of productivity, and the rate of productivity, we measure it, for example, from the time taken to get an animal to slaughter weight. You find that in the ranches and probably in the feedlots, it's taking about 4 years to get from an animal from the time it's calved to the time it's slaughtered. But then when you look to the pastoral communities, it's taking them about 6 or 7 years. So it's almost like, almost double the time taken for you to rear an animal to the point to slaughter it. And then that means that, of course, for the ranches and the areas where they're using feedlots, you have a quicker turnaround. You have more value, more return to land compared to the pastoral, where it's taking a much longer duration because of poor pasture. And of course, it also means that you cannot support animals that have been improved, or you cannot improve genetic material for the animals, because then it makes it tricky for them to survive in this harsh environment. And of course, because of these policies, we mentioned the fact that you have laws that are not recognizing the community institutions and the community norms in accessing land within the legal framework. It means that you cannot enforce them. And one of the key debates we had when we were doing this work was the whole issue of what secures land rights. Is it the formalization where you actually have a title deed where you can actually say, this is my land, this is my boundary? Or is it the security of tenure that is guaranteed in the institutions and mechanisms, practices and norms that communities are actually using and upholding to enforce these particular laws? As you move towards individualization, so I was giving you an example of like this is the Amboseli ecosystem. So once the community that was living around this area was the Maasai community. So initially, all of this land wasn't adjudicated, but then once the government adjudicated it, the land was registered to group ranches. And actually, you can see, I don't know if you can see this, but then you have several group ranches. So this is one group ranch. This is my lower group ranch. You have another group ranch here. You have another group ranch here. So the key difference here is that the group ranch, you create a boundary and you register the people, within that area, and then they become collectively the owners of that land. But then the important thing was that, and this is a key feature of pastoralists, is that because these guys are mobile and they're accessing land in different periods of time, they're moving with their animals, they're maintaining this pasture. There was no conflict with their migratory corridors. So these are the animals. So here we have a migration from Amboseli to Serengeti, both elephants, the herbivore, and of course the carnivores usually tend to follow the herbivores. But then there's no conflict because there are no fences. But then these guys, everybody is mobile, and the communities will know how to coexist within this ecosystem. So what happens is that after some point, then there's pressure to subdivide this land. Remember the trajectory I showed you from community ranches, and as you're moving towards more individual land tenure. And then this is like the map that, once the land now was adjudicated and they decided to divide. So this is one particular group ranch here. This is called Kimana. And this is how their land subdivision happened. So these small plots, this now is land that has been assigned to specific individuals. And it's not that small, because I think when we interviewed them in 2016, I think an individual was getting like 100 acres. 100 acres is about 25 hectares of land. So while it's not small in itself, but then remember that as a pastoralist, most of this, the average herd was about 150 cattle. So if you try to support 150 cattle in that piece of land, then the first pressure you get is the access to pasture. Remember that traditionally they would move the animals along this belt, and they would even come, if they wanted to access land that is belonging to another group ranch, then they would negotiate and either pay off either in cash or in livestock, and then they would be allowed to access. Of course, grazing in national park is in law is completely forbidden. But then the challenge was that once you start doing this, then for these individuals to, one of the key things they were doing was quickly selling off land. Once they got a title deed for that land, they were selling it to many people who are speculating in this land. And immediately the speculators would buy land. The next thing they would do is to fence it off. So you are not only interfering now with the pasture and access to pasture that these guys have been accessing communally, but now you're also interfering with the wildlife migration corridors, because the animals will not know that this land has been sold. They need to pass here, for example, to move to Serengeti. And of course, now you have conflict with both humans, as they are, especially the ones who have sold off land and they need to access pasture. Some of them would come and they'll destroy your fence and graze on your land illegally, but also you are also exacerbating the human-wildlife conflict. Then, of course, the other key thing that was immediately we realized, and this is something that was spreading across many pastoral areas, is that the environmental degradation worsened, especially in areas where people are selling off land. Because one of the things was that as you're selling off your land, you need to invade somebody else's land, because your small land can no longer now hold, is no longer enough for your animals. And then the most common thing is that you tended to overgraze. And then of course with overgrazing, so this looks like a river, but these are actually gullies as a result of soil erosion. And then of course, in some areas up north, for example, you find that because now nobody has the incentive to preserve land, then these are like an invasive species of this cacti, and basically where they would grow, no other pasture would grow. And this is again is something that became common. But then what we found, which was a key take home, was that yes, overgrazing is an issue, and there's need to continue providing extension knowledge to pastoralists for them to be able to keep animals that can be supported by the land in which they're accessing. But that is not the only problem. As soon as mobility is hampered, then you are forced to keep a lot of animals within a confined area. And actually that exacerbates the degradation. So we found that in areas where mobility was higher, although there was degradation because of still there's overexploitation in those areas as well, but it's not as bad as in areas where mobility was completely hampered. So what are the key take homes, the key lessons that we learned from this? So one is that the message is that community land tenure, collective land tenure supports strategies that can actually sustain productive system. The most important one, of course, was mobility. And if you allow for mobility, then you allow for grazing practices like mosaic grazing. So mosaic grazing, for example, traditionally, like some of these communities, especially both in East Africa and in Latin America, we found that they would zone off different grazing grounds. So they have areas where they graze during the rainy period. They have areas where they would live to graze in the dry seasons. And they're able to move from one area to those areas as they're depending on the need. So, and you don't have to move, for example, if right now we're experiencing drought in the north, so ordinarily they would have migrated to their dry season grazing areas. One of the other things that we've seen that is quite useful is the issue about split herding. So like in the case of Kenya, so we found that most pastoralists will keep a number of animals. So they'll keep camels, they'll keep cattle, they'll keep goats and sheep. So you basically split the herds based on their pasture requirements. And for animals like camels and donkeys, which can do a longer migration than cattle, you can actually take them to a longer period. We found that, for example, for the Andean pastoralists, the key animals they kept were the alpacas and llamas. And again, some of the practices they would do was to split, especially once they started doing genetic improvement. In Kenya, that is something again that we found that in some areas, some pastoralists had actually improved the animals. For example, towards the south of Nairobi, pastoralists in those areas have improved both their cattle and sheep by bringing superior breeds to improve their local varieties, the local breeds. And then for in the Andean region, we found that this is something that again was quite popular, especially given that the major output for the alpacas and the llamas is the wool. So they were able to breed animals that would give them superior wool, and they would get better prices as a result of that. And then, of course, the important thing also is about herd size management and trying to encourage pastoralists to keep animals that can actually be supported by the land that they have. So the main reason why pastoralists would overstock is basically a risk mitigation strategy, as opposed to how people think that they are not rational. Because if you have drought and you know that you're going to lose, let's say 50% of your animals, they would basically need to keep this so that they would have a places to start once the drought is over. So some of the practices like raiding, it used to be a restocking practice. Of course, it got to a point where the raiding has been abused. It's no longer the cultural raiding, but it's more of I think for the terminology we used in our study was organized crime. Sorry about that. Was organized crime. So in terms of sustaining practices, and especially as we compare the two different regions, you find that mobility and mosaic grazing is supported and it's actually practiced in Kenya and Peru. And then it can only happen, of course, when you have collective land tenure system. If in individual land where you have privatized land tenure, you can actually not practice this. Herd diversification, again, this is something that is widely practiced in the Andean region. In Kenya, we found that it's supported, but pastoralists are slowly making their move towards that. Split grazing, we found that it's practiced again in both contexts. And herd size management, we found that in both contexts, while it's something that was encouraged, in reality it wasn't practiced, as I've explained, because for pastoralists this is considered to be a risk mitigation practice for them. So what we are actually summarizing here is that, if you look at the things that can actually improve the production system for pastoralists, you can only sustain them under collective land tenure regimes. And as the trajectory to move towards individual and private land tenure, it's not compatible with sustainable pastoralism. And that's why it's important. Remember the question we posed earlier, why then, even after all this evidence, the government doesn't seem to push towards supporting the sustenance of pastoralist system. Then we actually found that, with this evidence and trying to talk to the different stakeholders and organizations and institutions working with pastoralism, we could actually lobby the government to maintain laws that actually encourage this. And one of the ways that you can actually achieve this is by recognizing the importance of pastoralism, especially in arid environments. It is a specialized system that can actually be sustained in the harsh and unpredictable conditions. And especially if you contextualize now the current scenario with climate change, you find that these communities already have indigenous knowledge of how to cope with this variability. And once the government starts recognizing this, then of course they need to move towards now strengthening governance system for communal lands. This is not done by the formal land system or trying to formalize the land systems as we know them, but it's about strengthening now the community institutions and systems for managing community land. That also comes by through recognitions of that those customary laws. And at least for Kenya, we were happy that now we've gotten to a point where the current community land law takes into account the customary norms that communities actually use to access their land. And the other key thing that we've also discussed is when we talk about the allocating rights, some of the things we found, even where we have established formal property rights, you can actually introduce transitory and temporary rights, especially to try and support migration, especially where some of these communities have been cut off from some of the key catchment areas. So to do this, in conclusion, so we need to support pastoral communities, especially on political engagement. So for a long time, these communities kind of took a backseat and they were alienated, especially from the political development. But right now, I think the movement is towards trying to strengthen their engagement. And of course, recognizing that when it comes to accessing resources, governance matters. And in our case, what we are recommending was that we needed to strengthen the community land management of their communal lands by recognizing and helping communities to be actually able to enforce their laws. Of course, we need to promote sustainable practices, for example, promoting land range ecology to rationalize how they use their land, how they can actually get more from that land in terms of return by improving their breeds so that you improve productivity as well as your margins. And you can now start talking about helping communities gravitate towards market orientation because then they have better value for their land. So this is what I wanted to share with you. I would like to pause here and take it back to Tom for the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Tim, for a fascinating talk. Can you stop sharing your screen so we can see you in the answers? Brilliant, fantastic. Okay, so we've got a few questions coming in on the Q&A at the moment. I wanted to ask you a question kind of following on from one of the last points you were making there about the fact that pastoralists in Kenya have not been involved in central government. And one of the reasons for that is that Kenya is a very ethnically diverse place and lots of different ethnic groups. And traditionally, pastoralists haven't been some of the more politically dominant groups. So do you think that those kind of different cultural histories of the different groups affects the attitudes or the policies towards pastoralists? So you've got kind of people that are more agriculturally oriented in their thinking. Do you think that affects their attitudes to what they see when they see pastoral lands?
Yeah.
And so that's the first question. And then related to that, in the Peru case, is it also the case that pastoralists are not that politically strong?
Yes, thank you, Tom. I think that's yes. Partly, the fact that we've had pastoral communities not being involved in the political sphere and the political decision making. Yeah, it has affected them both ways. One, we have people who are coming from an orientation of crop production that have now this bias when they look at pastoral lands. But also the other bias was that for pastoral communities, they also are unable to engage and try to kind of inform the political processes and the decisions. So, for example, if you look at in Kenya now, for the period from 1960 to almost 1990s, people were considering every time we had a stereotype of pastoral areas, they were associated with insecurity, cattle rustling, and basically the government completely marginalized them in the sense of public good investments. So they had poor outcomes when you think about education, health, access to water and all that. So the key challenge was until a point now where people started looking at it from a human rights perspective. And we are happy now that we have a constitution that tries to reverse this. So, for example, right now, when you look at resource allocation, these communities are given much more. They are given, the terminology we use is an utilization fund. Because of decades of marginalization, now they're being given more resources to try and catch up, if I can use that word, put more investments towards education and health, agriculture, and agriculture meaning that is not just crop, but also mainly also looking at livestock as an agricultural enterprise, so that they can actually catch up. In Peru, this was a similar case, and actually what helped the Andean communities were the extractive industries. So once they started undertaking extractive industries in the Andean region, it kind of helped give community a voice, and they were able now to negotiate for some revenues that actually would be used to help in terms of improving public goods supply in those areas in terms of roads, infrastructure, water and electricity, and also now build the capacity of the local communities. The challenge now was that as a result, the communities, once they improved their human capital, most of them now migrated to urban areas. In the case of Kenya, yeah, we've seen migration, but it's not necessarily because of human capital investment. It's more of now destitution, because you've sold off your lands. At some point, you lose your animals. And for you to survive now, you have to go and try to look for work in the urban areas.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a couple of questions on the Q&A, and then I'll come to the panelists with their hands up. So Nicholas Montalva asks, says, well, says, thank you for your talk. He says, I'm curious about the role of marriage and inheritance in the emergence of inequalities. I work in central Chile and have seen how inter-community marriages or difference in the number of heirs can lead to a few families concentrating membership to various communities and hence access to various collective lands, while other families are relegated to comparatively small fields. Have you seen this pattern of accumulation in the cases you've studied? Or maybe it doesn't happen in all places with unilateral descent or unigenital inheritance.
Yeah, so yeah, that's a really good question. I think in our case, we did not pick up the issue of inheritance, partly because we are I think it's patrilineal society. So what happens is that land, if I can give a quote, so usually the African, these communities, what they believe is that land is bequeathed through the male hair. So if a woman, for example, from a different tribe is married, she is not expected to go and access that land, but the male hair of that particular family that she's marrying into, she accesses through that male hair. So I think that partly explains why we don't see intermarriages being an issue. Previously, what communities used to do, actually intermarriage was one of the dispute resolution mechanisms. So when we had communities warring a lot, at some point they would organize certain cohorts to age groups to intermarry to try and maintain some peace, or make sure that even if you do cattle raiding, you don't necessarily doesn't lead to loss of human life, because basically these guys now have become your relatives. So you can go steal your animals, but you don't have to kill them. But then of course, that was what the practice culturally. Right now, of course, we've moved way beyond that now. So we have communities, they can choose whoever they want to marry. But for the communities that are accessing land collectively, the key recognition, of course, is through now the male hair. And if, for example, the reverse happens, that you have a man from a different community marrying a woman from a particular community, you are not given access to those lands. So that was one of the reasons that kind of affected that. We did not pick that in the Andean communities. I think most of them were basically one tribe. I think this was Quechua.
And then Nathan Slater's got another question about social norms, inheritance customs, and whether there's whether those contribute to pressures to obtain land outside of the tribe or the clan.
Yeah, so the only way now you can access that would be now the private land. So previously, these lands were basically tribal territories, but then the only way you could expand your territories by displacing another community. Yeah, in history, in our anthropology books, we see that we used to have some fights, for example, and in the case of the Maasai, you know, here the way we describe them, we have the Maasai of the south and the Maasai of the north. The Maasai of the north will be found in areas like Laikipia, as you go towards Nanyuki, which is another lowland area, closer to the Samburus. So traditionally, it is argued that these guys, once they started increasing, they sent some of their members to go and look for land. So they had to go and displace the Samburu to push them further back for them to be able to occupy those territories. But there's no documentation of whether that happened, because it's basically being passed on from one generation to another. But the only way communities would expand territories was through fights. You declare war, and then once you displace that community, then you can occupy that territory. But what we hypothesize, because they were not, you'd only do that when you have pressure. So for example, if there was a drought and you needed to look for pasture, so even though you are going to displace that community, it was just temporary for that period where you have drought and you're trying to solve that problem. And then ordinarily you would have expected the community to go back. But I think I would argue that right now, even especially from the 60s, where we now have more evidence in terms of documentation, the only way you could now access land was through now increasing land through private tenure, by either purchasing or getting allocations from the government, because that happened a lot, especially in the 60s and the 70s, through the land resettlement programs. So the communities that were in power were able to acquire more land through the government resettlement processes.
Okay, let's go to Monique.
Hi, Tim. That was a really interesting talk. Thanks so much. You covered the sort of tensions between individual and sort of collective landholding, very much at the sort of institutional level and the macro level. And I wondered what you know in terms of sort of reviewing all of these studies, what the pastoralist communities that you work with, what their preferences are. I'm kind of interested in the preferences of the people on the ground. And I mean, obviously they're going to be variable, and how are they associated with wealth, maybe herd size, or how dependent the community is on agriculture as well as raising livestock. So I'm just wondering what you know sort of on the ground about the preferences for different patterns of landholding in these communities in Kenya.
So Monique, I would divide these communities in two. So let me start with the Maasai, because the Maasai were amongst the first guys to privatize land tenure. And actually we have a lot of evidence that has been generated following the transition from community lands to private lands. Initially, the Maasai community did not want to privatize land. They were really against the establishment of, or even marking boundaries, where you now tell them that, and you are confining them to, specific membership, that these are the people who access land, because culturally they believed that they would access all the land that they could see. So from one horizon to the other. But then when they started losing land to the colonialists, at that point, they thought that by entering into treaties, it would actually help them keep their land. So they signed treaties with the colonial government that now paved way for the establishment of group ranches after the post-independence period. So once they accessed the group ranches, again, they did not want to establish individual land tenure. And then we actually see evidence of this because they continued to use customary norms to manage community land. But then the challenge was now, some of them now started getting educated, and then they became now the elite. And it is this elite that now introduced individual land tenure, because the elite needed to zone off some lands. And we see that trajectory similar. What happened now to the Maasai? It happened first to the Maasai, it happened to the Samburus, it happens to the Turkanas, where now the land, majority of the population would have preferred to continue accessing land communally, but now the local elite kind of now nudged them towards land privatization. In fact, for one of the communities we worked with in Samburu, we found that they kind of created a zone for their elite, and they were able to allocate, individual land to those elites, and then the rest now they continued accessing as communities. So in terms of preference, then I would argue that majority of them, especially given that they continue, most of them, even to date, even although they sold land, they continue to keep livestock. They actually appreciate the importance of livestock as an economic activity. And actually that the reason why I started with that economic value of livestock is because we also appreciate that the key challenge, of course, has been the misconception and how we characterize livestock production in those areas. But it's actually a very viable economic activity. The key challenge, of course, is now how do you deal with these other externalities? You need adequate pasture. For you to do that, of course, collective land system kind of guarantees that. You need better markets, not necessarily guaranteed by collective land tenure systems, but of course, if you have a bigger herd size, you have a better payoff in terms of whether when you're accessing the market, you can actually get substantial income. So for example, right now, if you think about the drought that is happening north, of course, the people with larger herd size, they have a bigger risk. You tend to, either the value of your animals shrinks very fast, because if you have weaker animals, they don't have a good weight, you get a low payoff. But also if they had now ways of conserving pasture, or the mitigation that you are saying, like being able to be mobile, then you are able to preserve your wealth. So even among the elite, even the ones who got those big chunks of land, they've continued to keep livestock. They've continued with, we've not seen a conversion either into crop farming or a different type of agricultural enterprise. So in that case, we would argue that the preference is still on livestock. I think the key challenge now has been to figure out how do you continue making it profitable under the changes and the pressure that we are seeing, either from urbanization, from population growth, from climate change, or from inefficient public policies that are actually biased against that. I hope I've answered.
Yeah, super interesting. Thanks so much.
Thanks.
Thank you. That was a very efficient answer as well, Tim, because you answered one of the questions on the Q&A as well at the same time, so about land zoning. So brilliant. Nathan.
Thanks, Tim. Really enjoyed it. And I think my question is kind of been asked by Thomas and others, which was about political power of different groups in national politics. But I guess one way to put it, or one question is there an example, thinking outside of Kenya within Africa, of a country that's been the most successful at implementing policies that are beneficial or sensitive to pastoral groups? And also, like, if that's not the case, outside of Africa, is there an example? Or is there even a country where pastoral groups have a voice, a large voice or a proportionate voice in national politics? So.
Yes, I think we do have some specific examples. Actually, during this work, we found we had communities in West Africa. I think there's the Sahel, not Sahel. I think there's some communities in This was what, Togo and northern Nigeria, as well as our neighbors in Karamoja. Of course, the Karamoja is it was a bait and switch technique where the government kind of created I think they used to call it a ministry of Karamoja, basically just to address pastoralist issues within that. Of course, they're supposed to cover the entire country, but then because this region kind of has the majority of the pastoralists, they kind of concentrated it in that particular region. And I think also now, what is happening in Kenya, in a way, has given a lot of voice to pastoral communities. We have now the decentralized system, whereby now you have resources going to these specific regions, and then independently, they choose what to do with the resources that they're getting. So like the county governments within the pastoral areas, in Kenya now they are formed, they're calling it a northern frontier, basically to try and resolve the pastoral issues together, although that is a more recent development. But from the studies, I think the ones that I found were quite informative were communities in Namibia. I'm trying to remember the name, but there was a community in Namibia which we found that was able to engage and kind of lobby the government to provide more resources that were helping them move towards commercial beef production.
Monique, do you want to ask your question that you put in the chat?
Yeah, yes. Sorry about that. I wasn't meaning to push in.
That's all right.
I couldn't get the Q&A to answer, so to accept it. So I mean, this was a bit off track, but it kind of seems interesting from Kenya's point of view. I know your focus was not on ranching and feedlots, but obviously was on the agro-pastoralists, because that's what you work on. But I was wondering why productivity, if I understood it right, was so low. It looks like most of the meat comes from the pastoralist and agro-pastoralist populations in Kenya. And yet, even though you said that it only takes 4 years to get meat to the market for the feedlot and ranching families, whereas it obviously takes much longer for the pastoralists. So was it just the numbers that there's so few feedlot and ranchers in Kenya?
Yes.
Or is there something else going on?
No, it's just because of right now we only have 3 feedlots in the country. So it's just that the numbers are small. And then for ranches, I think we are about 160 ranches. So the reason why their production is less, of course, is the number, but of course the productivity is much higher. And then most of the land is still under agro-pastoral and pastoral systems. So the current strategy right now that the government is trying to implement, they're trying to increase the public sector supported feedlots in pastoral areas. They have, I think, planned for about, I think there are 16 feedlots, mainly within the agro-pastoral areas, because at least within those areas, it's viable to establish a feedlot. The key challenge is that for feedlots, it's not just pasture. You also need to import some inputs, and most of these inputs are having to be imported. So right now, the discussion is mainly on the viability of these feedlots, because if you don't get it in a good enough scale, then it's not gonna improve productivity for the animals. And then of course, pastoralists must accept to improve their genetic material for the animals. Because if you do the feedlot with the traditional variety, I mean the traditional breeds, then of course you're still gonna get low output and your turnover gets to be small. But then if you can improve the animals and you can improve the genetic material, then you have a much faster turnover. And then if you have higher volumes, then we see a very good potential of even exporting beef from pastoral areas, because most of it then would fit, it meets the conditions, especially for the European markets that require like grass-fed, grass-fed beef. So that is something that we know there's high potential for that now. For us, from an economic point of view, the key debate is whether it should be the government doing this or the private sector doing this, so that the government actually creates room for the private sector to make this kind of investments.
Yeah, yeah, I see. Thanks.
Thanks, thanks, Monique. I've got one last question. So thinking about this kind of from a, I think about this as a person involved in kind of evolutionary science and evolutionary thinking. I look at kind of the pastoralist system and think about it in terms of adaptation, and it's kind of these kind of cultural adaptations to the environment. Yet that doesn't seem to be the perspective that policymakers have taken, or sometimes even economists more widely. So is that characterization of that economic point of view accurate? And if so, what can we do to try and change those attitudes?
Yeah, I think, I would totally agree with you. And I think from a person as a person who has benefited from working with people from different fields, I think we are happy that if we can actually promote multidisciplinary research, because I think when we did the first study, when we started, we benefited from somebody who was not an economist, who could look at the social and cultural issues and inform us, actually help us understand why certain things were going the way they were going. I think for us, even as scientists, I think undertaking this kind of more interdisciplinary studies, because then you get to benefit from a skill that you had no idea about, or you're able to look at things from a perspective that you'd ordinarily not have looked at. I think if I'd done this study without this team, I would have just gone there, probably just look at the cost and benefits, and then argued from a cost-benefit analysis kind of way that, and actually, unfortunately, we need to change some of these terminologies. Like when we say that pastoralist is low input, low output, it's not necessarily true, because it's low input because of the context in which they're actually existing in. So if we can, even for us, become more sensitive to some of these terminologies, that we can actually contextualize it and not try to compare it with the intensified system that we are used to. Because I think for most economies, the starting point is usually from a highly intensified production system. So when you go to like an extensive system, the first thing you're looking for is those intensive practices, intensive investments. And then that maybe that's kind of leading to this kind of terminologies. But then what we think is that by learning also from other sciences, I think that is something that can really help change attitudes, because then you start appreciating, even from a cultural perspective, why, for example, pastoralists would insist on being mobile. To date, and this is something that I'm happy that we're working on this together. When you look at, for example, even simple metrics like how we measure poverty, one of the key indicators is the type of dwelling. If you are mobile, then you are likely to put up a house that you can easily dismantle, pack it, and move it to your next dwelling place. But then our way, if you look at the national statistics, of course, then immediately you have that you don't have a permanent roof, you don't have a permanent wall, you don't have a permanent floor. You are immediately classified as poor. And then forgetting that, like some of these pastoralists, if you, a camel, I think the market value for a camel is about 200,000 shillings on average. This is about $2,000, one animal. So if a guy has 10 animals and is living in a tent, this guy is much better off than a guy in the city who is living in an apartment building, who probably annual income wouldn't be $20,000. But now, because of this perception, I think undertaking these studies and also now making sure that we reach policymakers with our findings and especially the multidisciplinary research, I think it's one of the best ways to try and change the narrative. I'm happy because right now I come across a lot of literature that is all about changing the narrative. that pastoralism is not backward. Pastoralism is actually ecological friendly. It can actually help you make more economic return from that particular land. And of course, trying to provide a counterfactual. If today we wanted to irrigate, let's say in the northern areas, while it's feasible on paper, it's very expensive to get water to those areas. And the government, actually, one of the things they've tried to do, again, is being misinformed by this kind of decisions, where they think that, oh, we can put up a dam and give these guys water, and because that land is fertile, you can actually grow crops there. But then forgetting that, especially with the changing, the weather variability, it's not going to be easy. And then, of course, production is not just about the soil, it's also about, you know, the agroecology and the biodiversity that has to adapt to that particular environment and ecosystem. So I think we hope that we can actually move faster towards that inclusivity, where we actually see these areas for its real potential rather than try to convert. And I think also what Nathan mentioned, the issue about political power is key, because also if you have a pastoralist voicing what he wants is different from a researcher like myself trying to speak on behalf of pastoralists. So giving them also that political power is also key, especially in making sure that their voice is actually heard.
Brilliant. Thank you. Really interesting and valuable point to finish on. So thank you very much again, Tim, for a fascinating talk and a great discussion of the various points. Yeah. So yeah. Oh, that's okay. Yeah, that's okay. Just to say, so next week we have our talk is going to be, or just people need to be aware that the clocks change in the United States next weekend, so just be careful about the time. Next week we have Monique Bogov-Mulder talking to us about polygyny, with the title of the talk, How Many Wives? Tracing the Interdisciplinary Career of the Polygyny Threshold Model. So thanks very much, Tim, and thanks to everybody for attending, and we'll see you all next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tim.
Bye-bye.